Everly Mason's hands trembled as she flipped through the contract pages, her eyes widening with each clause she discovered. The sleek conference room of Blackwood Enterprises, 50 floors above Chicago's bustling streets, suddenly felt airless. "This can't be right," she whispered, looking up at the HR director whose plastic smile hadn't wavered. 5 years with no possibility of resignation without paying a penalty equal to 3 times my annual salary. "It's standard for employees with access to proprietary designs, Ms. Mason," the woman replied, sliding a pen closer. "You did sign it 3 days ago." Everly ran her fingers through her auburn hair, mentally calculating the impossible sum. She had been so excited about landing a position at one of the country's most prestigious design firms that she'd signed without proper scrutiny. A rookie mistake that had effectively sold her future. "I need to speak with someone about renegotiating these terms," Everly said, rising from her chair. "My grandmother is ill, and I can't be locked into these hours without flexibility." The HR director's smile tightened. The only person who could authorize such changes would be Mr. Blackwood himself, and he doesn't renegotiate contracts. 20 minutes later, Everly found herself outside Nathaniel Blackwood's office, clutching her portfolio like a shield. Through the glass doors, she could see a man in his mid-30s standing by floor-to-ceiling windows, his silhouette sharp against the Chicago skyline. His assistant, an older woman with perfectly coiffed silver hair, finally nodded toward the door. "Mr. Blackwood will see you now," she said, her expression oddly sympathetic. The CEO of Blackwood Enterprises didn't look up when Everly entered. He was reviewing documents, his angular face set in concentration. At 35, Nathaniel Blackwood had already been featured in Fortune's 40 Under 40 twice, known for transforming his family's modest design firm into a corporate giant through ruthless efficiency. "Ms. Mason, I understand you have concerns about your contract," he said finally, steel gray eyes assessing her with clinical detachment. "Please sit." Everly remained standing. "Mr. Blackwood, I made a mistake signing without reviewing the terms, but these conditions are unreasonable. No one should be essentially indentured to their employer." Indentured? A slight raise of his eyebrow was the only indication of surprise. An interesting choice of words for a compensation package that exceeds industry standards by 30%. He reached for her portfolio, which she reluctantly handed over. As he flipped through her designs, Everly noticed how his fingers lingered on her conceptual pieces. "Your work shows promise," he said, closing the portfolio. "That's why we acquired you." Acquired. The word stung. "You make it sound like I'm property." "Ms. Mason, everything has value in business. Talent, time, ideas, they're all commodities. Your creativity is an asset to Blackwood, one we've paid a premium to secure." He returned her portfolio. "The contract stands. Then I'll find legal counsel," Everly challenged, even as she recognized the futility of facing Blackwood's army of attorneys. For the first time, something like amusement crossed his features. "You're welcome to try. In the meantime, I expect the Kensington project proposals on my desk by Wednesday." Everly left his office with her cheeks burning, clutching her portfolio so tightly her knuckles turned white. In the elevator down to the design floor, she caught her reflection in the polished doors, flushed face, defiant green eyes, and a set jaw. She might be trapped, but she wouldn't be broken. "How'd it go?" asked Cameron, a fellow designer who had started the same day. "I'm apparently a recent acquisition," Everly replied bitterly. "Blackwood doesn't see employees, he sees assets." Cameron lowered his voice. "Word is, he wasn't always like this. Eleanor, his assistant, has been here since the beginning. She says he changed after his brother died." Everly set her portfolio on her desk, mind racing with possibilities for escape that seemed increasingly remote. "I don't care about his tragic backstory. I need to find a way out of this contract." That evening, as the design floor emptied, Everly stayed, poring over the Kensington project. If she was trapped, she would at least make her work undeniable. Around midnight, as she gathered her things, she noticed a light still on in Blackwood's office. Through the glass walls, she could see him staring at something small in his palm, his usual mask of indifference replaced by an expression of such raw grief that Everly froze. For a moment, he wasn't the cold CEO who had dismissed her concerns, but a man haunted by something she couldn't understand. Then, as if sensing her gaze, he looked up. Their eyes locked across the empty office floor, and Everly felt a peculiar shift in the air between them, recognition, perhaps, of something unexpected in the other. She broke the connection first, hurrying to the elevator. As the doors closed, she caught one last glimpse of Nathaniel Blackwood returning whatever he had been holding to his desk drawer, his impassive mask firmly back in place. Everly leaned against the elevator wall, unsettled by what she had witnessed. The man who had effectively purchased 5 years of her life was more complex than she had initially judged. That didn't make him less dangerous. It made him more so. 3 weeks into her employment at Blackwood Enterprises, Everly had established herself as both an asset and a problem. Her designs for the Kensington project had won the account, but her refusal to conform to the company's rigid hierarchy made her a subject of whispered conversations. Mason, Parker Wells, the design director, called across the open workspace. Mr. Blackwood wants the entire team in the conference room. New campaign for Meridian Luxury. Everly grabbed her tablet and followed the stream of designers filing into the glass-walled conference room. Nathaniel Blackwood stood at the head of the table, his tailored navy suit as impeccable as his posture. Meridian is launching a new hotel chain targeting millennials with disposable income, he announced without preamble. They want aggressive, edgy, exclusive. Our approach needs to make potential customers feel that booking anywhere else would be settling for mediocrity. As the marketing director outlined a campaign built around exclusivity and status anxiety, Everly found herself frowning. When Blackwood finally asked for input, the room fell silent, except for her. This approach feels dated, she said, ignoring Parker's warning glance. Millennials with money are more drawn to authenticity and experience than exclusivity. They want to feel connected, not separated. The silence that followed was absolute. Blackwood's gaze fixed on her, unreadable. Do you have an alternative suggestion, Ms. Mason? His tone revealed nothing. Everly pulled up a rough concept on her tablet and projected it onto the main screen. Instead of above the rest, what about beyond the expected? We showcase authentic local experiences that guests can access through Meridian's connections, things money alone can't buy without insider knowledge. For 30 seconds, Blackwood studied her design. The room collectively held its breath. Develop both approaches, he finally said. Parker, have complete proposals for each by Monday. As the meeting adjourned, Everly felt the mixed reactions of her colleagues, some impressed, others resentful. She had nearly reached the door when Blackwood's voice stopped her. Ms. Mason, a word. When the room emptied, he gestured to a chair. Your approach is interesting, but I'm curious why you felt compelled to challenge the established direction in front of the entire team. Because it was wrong for the client, she answered simply. And I'm still trying to earn the 3 times my salary you'd charge me for leaving. Something that might have been amusement flickered across his face before disappearing. Your creativity is an asset, Mason, but don't mistake that for immunity. The tense moment was interrupted when his assistant Eleanor hurried in, clutching a file. Mr. Blackwood, your 3 o'clock is here, and there's been an issue with the Tokyo office that needs immediate. She stopped, noticing a paper that had fallen from her file. Everly bent to retrieve it. It wasn't a document, but a photograph. 2 young men on a sailboat, laughing into the camera. One was unmistakably a younger Nathaniel Blackwood, but so transformed by genuine joy that he seemed a different person entirely. Eleanor snatched the photo with surprising speed. Thank you, she said, her eyes conveying a clear warning. That will be all, Ms. Mason. Blackwood dismissed her, his attention already on his next meeting. Later that afternoon, Everly found Eleanor waiting by her desk, the older woman's expression guarded. That photo, Eleanor began quietly, is personal. Mr. Blackwood would prefer it forgotten. Who was the other man? Everly asked. Eleanor hesitated. Julian, his younger brother. She glanced around to ensure they weren't overheard. He wasn't always like this, you know. Before Julian's accident, Nathaniel was different, passionate about design, not just profit margins. What happened? 5 years ago. A car crash. Eleanor's eyes misted slightly. Julian was the creative genius. Nathaniel was the business mind. After we lost Julian, she straightened, professional mask returning. It doesn't matter now. Just remember, Ms. Mason, there are reasons why people become who they are. The following week, Meridian Luxury chose Everly's concept. Blackwood announced this with the same detachment he might report quarterly earnings, but he assigned her as lead designer. It should have felt like victory, but as Everly watched him during the announcement, noted how he constantly twisted a silver ring on his little finger, a nervous gesture at odds with his controlled exterior, she found herself wondering about the man in the sailboat photo, whose smile had reached his eyes. 2 months into the Meridian project, disaster struck. A server crash lost 3 weeks of work, and the team faced working through the weekend to recover. At midnight on Saturday, most had gone home for a few hours of sleep. Everly remained, determined to salvage her contributions. The office was eerily quiet when the elevator doors opened and Nathaniel Blackwood stepped out, clearly not expecting anyone else to be there. He'd shed his suit jacket and tie, and his white shirt sleeves were rolled up, the most casual she'd ever seen him. "Ms. Mason," he acknowledged, surprise evident in his voice. "It's after midnight. I could say the same to you," she replied, too tired for formality. Instead of continuing to his office, he approached her desk, studying the fragments of designs she'd managed to recover. "You've reimagined the entire rooftop bar concept," he observed. The crash was actually helpful. The original wasn't working. She rubbed her eyes. Sometimes destruction forces better creation. He was quiet for so long that she looked up to find him watching her with an unfamiliar expression. "My brother used to say something similar," he finally said, his voice softer than she'd ever heard it. "That constraints breed creativity." It was the first time he'd voluntarily mentioned Julian, and the significance wasn't lost on her. For a moment, the impenetrable seal seemed almost human. "He sounds like he understood design," she ventured. Julian understood everything about creative vision. A shadow crossed his face. "I simply make sure the business survives." Before she could respond, he straightened, the moment of openness vanishing. "Don't stay too late, Ms. Mason. I need your best work on Monday, not your exhausted work." As he walked away, Everly called after him. "Why do you do that?" He paused. "Do what?" "Retreat the moment you show any hint of being human." For a second, she thought she'd overstepped fatally. Then, surprisingly, his lips curved in what might almost have been a smile. "Perhaps because some things, once broken, are safer kept behind glass," he answered, and continued to his office. The following morning, Everly woke on the office sofa to find a cashmere throw covering her and a cup of fresh coffee on the table beside her. There was no note, no acknowledgement, but as she clutched the warm cup, she wondered if the man of ice might be beginning to thaw, and what that would mean for them both. "You want me to what?" Everly stared at Parker across the design floor, certain she'd misheard. "Accompany Mr. Blackwood to Lake Haven for the retreat center site visit," he repeated, looking as surprised as she felt. His direct request. 3 months had passed since the midnight conversation, during which Nathaniel Blackwood had maintained his usual professional distance. The Meridian campaign had launched to industry acclaim, establishing Everly as a rising star at Blackwood Enterprises, but it hadn't softened the terms of her contract. "When do we leave?" she asked, already mentally rearranging her schedule. "Tomorrow morning. Private airfield, 7 a.m. Parker handed her a folder. "All the details are in here. It's just you and him, so good luck." The next morning, Everly arrived at the small executive airport where a sleek Cessna Citation waited on the tarmac. Nathaniel Blackwood was already there, reviewing documents in the passenger cabin. "Ms. Mason," he greeted without looking up. "Your punctuality is appreciated." The interior was luxurious but compact, forcing a proximity that made Everly acutely aware of him as they took off. For 30 minutes, silence reigned except for the hum of engines. She opened her laptop, reviewing the retreat center plans, conscious of his occasional glances at her screen. "Your revisions to the central pavilion are interesting," he finally remarked, "though perhaps too ambitious for the budget." "The budget allows for it if we use local Michigan timber instead of imported materials," she countered. "It would also align with Blackwood's new sustainability commitment." He raised an eyebrow. "You've done your research." "I always do," she replied simply. As the flight continued, Everly noticed his habitual gesture, twisting the silver ring on his pinky finger, had intensified. When turbulence hit, his knuckles whitened around the armrest. "Not a fan of flying?" she asked. "Not particularly," he admitted. Julian loved it. He had a pilot's license. It was the second time he'd voluntarily mentioned his brother to her. "Is that his ring?" she ventured, nodding toward his hand. Nathaniel's fingers stilled. Yes, a reminder. Of what? His gray eyes met hers, unexpectedly vulnerable. Of consequences. The small plane dipped suddenly through a pocket of rough air, ending the conversation as Nathaniel's jaw clenched. When they landed at the small regional airport near Lake Haven, his relief was palpable. By the time they reached the lakeside lodge where they'd be staying, dark clouds had gathered over Lake Michigan. The property manager greeted them apologetically. "Mr. Blackwood, I'm afraid there's a severe storm warning. The local authorities are advising against site visits today and possibly tomorrow depending on conditions." Nathaniel's frustration was evident. "We have a tight schedule. How severe is severe?" "They're predicting power outages, possible flooding on the lower roads." The manager glanced out the window where trees were already bending in the strengthening wind. "I'd recommend staying put." After the manager left them in the Rustic Lux lobby, Nathaniel turned to Everly. "We'll use the time to review the plans in detail. I want to be ready the moment we can access the site." Hours later, ensconced in the lodge's conference room with architectural renderings spread across the table, they were deep in discussion when the lights flickered and went out. Emergency generators kicked in seconds later, providing dim lighting. "Perhaps we should continue tomorrow," Everly suggested, rubbing her eyes. Outside, the storm had intensified to a howling gale that rattled the windows. Nathaniel checked his watch. "It's only 8 p.m. We still have several sections to cover." "We've been at this for 10 hours, she pointed out. "Even your valuable assets need rest." His mouth tightened at her choice of words, a deliberate reminder of their first conversation. Before he could respond, his phone rang. After a brief conversation, his expression darkened. "The site has suffered some damage already. Trees down across the access road." He pocketed his phone. "We may need to extend our stay." The thought of additional days trapped with Nathaniel Blackwood made Everly's stomach twist with conflicting emotions. She excused herself and retreated to her room, where she paced restlessly, staring out at the tempestuous lake. The wind-whipped waves mirrored her internal turmoil. 5 months of her life already signed away to a company that treated people like commodities. The prospect of years more stretched before her like a prison sentence. In Chicago, the playing field was tilted entirely in Blackwood's favor. But here, far from corporate headquarters and its army of lawyers, perhaps she had a chance. The decision crystallized suddenly. Grabbing her coat and purse, Everly made her way downstairs. The night manager was distracted dealing with other guests concerned about the storm. The key rack behind the desk included several sets labeled lodge vehicles. With a quick glance to ensure no one was watching, she reached over and grabbed a set. In the parking garage beneath the lodge, she found the corresponding SUV. The rational part of her brain screamed this was madness, driving in a violent storm toward an unfamiliar town. But desperation muted the warning. The next town was only 20 miles away. Surely there would be a lawyer there who could help her challenge the contract, or at least negotiate better terms before returning. The SUV handled well on the main road, despite the battering rain and gusting wind. Everly white-knuckled the steering wheel, peering through windshield wipers that struggled to keep up with the deluge. She'd gone perhaps 5 miles when her phone rang, Blackwood's name lighting up the screen. She ignored it. 3 miles later, disaster struck. A massive tree branch crashed across the road directly ahead. Everly swerved instinctively, sending the SUV sliding toward the shoulder. She overcorrected, and the vehicle spun, tires losing traction on the flooded pavement. With sickening inevitability, it slid off the road and down a wooded embankment, finally jolting to a stop against a tree. Dazed but uninjured, Everly assessed her situation. The SUV was hopelessly stuck, its front end crumpled against the tree. Rain hammered the roof, and through the windows, she could see nothing but darkness and thrashing trees. Her phone showed no signal. With no other option, she pulled on her coat and stepped out into the storm, immediately drenched by the freezing rain. Looking up the embankment to the road, she realized the climb back would be treacherous in these conditions. Her only choice was to follow what appeared to be a trail through the woods, hoping it led somewhere with shelter. An hour later, thoroughly lost and shivering uncontrollably, Everly stumbled through the forest. Her coat, designed for Chicago's urban winters rather than Michigan wilderness, provided little protection against the penetrating rain and dropping temperature. Hypothermia was becoming a real concern. As her strength flagged, a distant bobbing light caught her attention. She changed direction, moving toward it with renewed determination. The light grew brighter, splitting into two beams, flashlights. "Hello," she tried to call, but her voice was lost in the storm's roar. The beams swept closer, then suddenly fixed on her. Through sheets of rain, a tall figure approached, face obscured by a hooded raincoat. Then the hood fell back, revealing Nathaniel Blackwood's face, transformed by an emotion she'd never seen on him before: fear. "Everly." His voice cracked as he reached her, grasping her shoulders. "My God, you're freezing." Without hesitation, he shrugged off his heavy weatherproof coat and wrapped it around her, pulling her against him for additional warmth. "How did you find me?" she managed through chattering teeth. "The SUV's GPS," he said grimly, guiding her toward where another figure waited, a local search and rescue volunteer. "What were you thinking?" Even through her exhaustion, the irony wasn't lost on her. "That I wanted freedom," she whispered. "Isn't that what everyone wants?" His arm tightened around her as he helped her navigate the treacherous terrain. "Not at the cost of their life," he said, his usual controlled tone fractured by genuine emotion. "Never that." Everly woke to sunlight streaming through unfamiliar windows. For a disorienting moment, she couldn't place her surroundings. Then memories of the storm, the crash, and the rescue flooded back. She was in her room at the Lake Haven Lodge, though she had no recollection of the return journey. A soft knock at the door preceded Eleanor's entrance, carrying a tray. "Eleanor, what are you doing here?" Everly's voice emerged as a rasp. "Mr. Blackwood flew me in on the company helicopter once the weather cleared," the assistant explained, setting down the tray. "You've been asleep for nearly 20 hours. The doctor says you have mild pneumonia." Everly tried to sit up and was immediately hit by a wave of dizziness. "Doctor," a local physician, Mr. Blackwood insisted on medical attention. Eleanor poured tea. "You gave him quite a scare, Ms. Mason." The idea of Nathaniel Blackwood being scared of anything seemed implausible. "Where is he now?" "Canceling meetings. He's postponed all site visits until you're well enough to travel." Eleanor's expression softened. "He hasn't left the lodge since they brought you back." Everly sipped the tea, letting this information settle. "I stole a company vehicle and crashed it trying to escape my contract. I assumed I'd be fired." Eleanor's lips twitched. "Yes, well, Mr. Blackwood can surprise you." Later that evening, after sleeping most of the day, Everly ventured out of her room wrapped in a thick robe provided by the lodge. The main living area was deserted except for Nathaniel Blackwood, sitting before a crackling fire, a tumbler of amber liquid in his hand. He looked up as she approached, fatigue evident in the shadows beneath his eyes. "You should be resting." "I've been horizontal for nearly a day," she said, easing into the opposite chair. "Thank you for the rescue." Nathaniel studied the fire. "Why did you run?" The question hung between them, deceptively simple. Everly considered deflecting, but something in the quiet intimacy of the fire-lit room demanded honesty. "Because I felt trapped," she finally said. 5 years of my life signed away in fine print. I've never been good at captivity. Is working for Blackwood Enterprises truly comparable to imprisonment?" There was no anger in his tone, only genuine curiosity. "When you have no real choice, any obligation becomes a cage," she answered. "I have a grandmother in assisted living. I need flexibility sometimes. Your contract allows none." Nathaniel swirled his drink thoughtfully. "You could have requested accommodations." Everly laughed softly. "From the man who told me my creativity was an asset he'd purchased? Who referred to hiring me as an acquisition?" He winced slightly. "I can see how that characterization would be off-putting." "Why do you do it?" she asked suddenly. "Build these walls? Treat people like commodities?" "Eleanor says you weren't always like this." The question hung in the air so long she thought he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, almost confessional. "After Julian died, the board wanted to sell, break up the company he loved." Nathaniel's fingers found the silver ring, twisting it absently. The only way to save it was to make it profitable enough that selling became unthinkable. That required a certain approach. Ruthless efficiency, Everly supplied. "Yes." He met her eyes. "I became what the company needed." "At what cost to yourself?" The question seemed to startle him. "It doesn't matter. The company survives. Julian's vision continues, even if through a different lens." Fever made Everly bolder than usual. Julian's gone, Nathaniel. But you're still here, living half a life. Silence fell, broken only by the popping of logs in the fireplace. Finally, he asked, "Would you like to know about him, Julian?" When she nodded, Nathaniel began speaking, haltingly at first, then with increasing fluency. He told her about Julian's creative brilliance, his ability to see possibilities where others saw only limitations. How the brothers had complemented each other perfectly, Julian's artistic vision balanced by Nathaniel's business acumen. He designed the most innovative pieces in our early collections, Nathaniel said, his usual reserve dissolving as memories surfaced. Clients would come to him with impossible requests, and he'd find a way. Like me with the Meridian campaign, Everly observed. Yes. Nathaniel looked at her with new awareness. That's part of why I assigned you as lead. You reminded me of him. As the fire burned lower, Everly learned how Julian had died, a car accident after a company celebration. How Nathaniel had received the call at 2 a.m. How he'd identified his brother's body, then returned to the office 3 hours later to prevent a client from walking away. The company was in crisis, he explained. If I had allowed myself to grieve properly, everything Julian built might have collapsed. So you locked it away? Everly said softly. Along with everything else that made you human. Nathaniel's smile held no humor. An effective strategy, until recently. What changed? He looked at her directly, his mask slipping to reveal raw honesty. You happened, Ms. Mason. Your inconvenient habit of seeing beyond facades. The intensity of his gaze made her heart quicken. For a moment, she glimpsed the man from the sailboat photograph, passionate, alive, unguarded. Then a log collapsed in the fireplace, breaking the spell. You should return to bed, he said, his tone gentler than she'd ever heard it. Doctor's orders. Everly rose, suddenly aware of her exhaustion. At the doorway, she paused. Nathaniel? Thank you for finding me in the storm. Always. He replied simply, the word carrying a weight neither of them was prepared to examine. Over the next 3 days, as Everly recovered, a new rhythm developed. They worked remotely from the lodge, reviewing site plans and contractor bids. Without the corporate environment, Nathaniel's demeanor softened. He listened more, dictated less. When Everly's fever spiked one night, he sat beside her bed, applying cool compresses to her forehead while Eleanor fetched the doctor. In her half-conscious state, Everly murmured, "Why are you being so kind to the asset that tried to escape?" His hand stilled on her brow. "Because you've reminded me that people aren't assets, Everly. They're irreplaceable." When they finally returned to Chicago, something fundamental had shifted between them. Nathaniel began seeking her input on projects beyond her department. He approved her request for flexible hours to visit her grandmother. The contract remained unchanged, but the man enforcing it had transformed. Eleanor noticed at first how Nathaniel actually laughed during a meeting when Everly made a wry observation. Later, she confronted Everly in the break room. "Whatever happened in Lake Haven?" The older woman said quietly, "Thank you. He's coming back to himself." "Nothing happened," Everly insisted, though the statement felt dishonest. Something had happened, not physically, but in the space between words, in firelight confessions and storm-driven revelations. Late one evening, as they refined the retreat center concept together, Nathaniel looked up from his drafting table to find Everly asleep on his office sofa, exhausted from a marathon design session. Without thinking, he removed his jacket and gently laid it over her. From the doorway, Eleanor observed the tender gesture. When Nathaniel turned and saw her watching, he expected embarrassment to surface. Instead, he felt only a quiet certainty. "She's changing everything, isn't she?" Eleanor asked softly. Nathaniel looked back at Everly's sleeping form. "No," he replied thoughtfully. "She's restoring it." For the first time in 5 years, Eleanor saw genuine peace in his expression. "Welcome back," she whispered, too low for him to hear, and quietly closed the door. "The Blackwood Retreat will redefine corporate wellness spaces," Nathaniel concluded, clicking through the final slide of his presentation. The boardroom erupted in applause, executives nodding appreciatively at the innovative designs projected on the screen. 6 weeks had passed since Lake Haven. The Retreat Center project had accelerated, with Everly's concept becoming the centerpiece of Blackwood's new corporate identity. one that balanced profitability with environmental consciousness and employee well-being. Questions? Nathaniel asked, his gaze automatically finding Everly at the back of the room. Charles Whitman, head of finance, raised his hand. These sustainability features, they impact the bottom line considerably. They also position us ahead of industry standards. Everly interjected before Nathaniel could respond. And qualify us for tax incentives that offset 40% of the additional cost. Nathaniel nodded, the slight curve of his lips suggesting approval. Ms. Mason has done extensive research. The numbers work. After the meeting adjourned, Everly gathered her materials, aware of the speculative glances from colleagues. Her rising influence hadn't gone unnoticed, nor had Nathaniel's increasing tendency to seek her opinion. Whispers had started, nothing concrete, but enough to create an undercurrent of tension in the office. Mason, Parker appeared beside her. The executive reception tonight. I assume you'll be there? I wasn't invited, Everly replied, confused. You are now, he said, sliding an embossed card across the table. Blackwood wants the entire creative team present to showcase the retreat designs to potential investors. The reception was held at the Chicago Art Institute, its marble halls transformed by subtle lighting and elegant floral arrangements. Everly moved through the crowd in a simple emerald dress, explaining concept boards to interested parties while trying to ignore the weight of Nathaniel's occasional glances from across the room. She was discussing renewable materials with a sustainability investor when a voice interrupted. Well, isn't this cozy? Nate always did have an eye for fresh talent. Everly turned to find a striking woman in her late 30s, razor-sharp in a crimson-sheath dress. Her dark hair was pulled into a sleek chignon, emphasizing sculptural cheekbones and calculating eyes. I don't believe we've met, Everly said, extending her hand. Victoria Harrington, CEO of Apex Design Group. The woman's handshake was brief but firm. And you're Everly Mason, Nate's new protege. Something in her tone made the words sound suggestive. Before Everly could respond, Victoria continued. I'm curious, is he still wearing that ridiculous ring? Julian's ring. She sipped her champagne, eyes never leaving Everly's face. Such a sentimental gesture for a man who claims to have no heart. Everly maintained her professional smile through sheer force of will. You knew Julian Blackwood? Victoria's laugh held no warmth. Knew him? Darling, I was married to him. She leaned closer, her perfume expensively overwhelming. Until Nate's business decisions got him killed. Everly felt as though the floor had shifted beneath her. I should return to my guests, she said evenly, refusing to show how much the revelation had shaken her. Of course. Victoria's smile was predatory. Just a word of advice. Don't get too comfortable being the favorite. Nate discards people when they're no longer useful. Ask anyone. Throughout the remainder of the evening, Everly found her gaze drawn repeatedly to Victoria, who skillfully worked the room, leaving subtle ripples of discomfort in her wake. Nathaniel seemed to be deliberately maintaining distance from his former sister-in-law, though Everly caught him watching Victoria with guarded vigilance. Later, as the event wound down, Everly found herself alone on a terrace overlooking Millennium Park, needing a moment away from the charged atmosphere inside. She has that effect on people, Nathaniel said quietly, joining her at the railing. Making you question what you thought you knew. Everly turned to him. She said she was Julian's wife. She was. His expression tightened. The marriage lasted 8 months before the accident. She also implied you were responsible for his death. Nathaniel's hands gripped the railing, knuckles whitening. Victoria has her version of events. And what's yours? Everly asked softly. He was silent for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. It's complicated, he finally said. And not a story for tonight. Nathaniel, Ms. Mason, he interrupted, his tone suddenly formal. We should return inside. Our investors are waiting. The abrupt shift back to professional distance stung more than Everly expected. As they re-entered the gallery, Victoria caught her eye across the room, raising her glass in mock salute. The next morning, Everly arrived early, intending to research Victoria Harrington before the workday began. What she found troubled her. Apex Design Group had once been a subsidiary of Blackwood Enterprises, spun off into an independent company shortly after Julian's death. Victoria had leveraged grief and sympathy into substantial venture capital, positioning Apex as Blackwood's main competitor within 2 years. Eleanor found her still researching when the office began filling. I see you've discovered our nemesis, the assistant observed, placing coffee on Everly's desk. Why didn't anyone mention her before? Everly asked. We don't speak her name in these halls. Eleanor replied with unusual sharpness. Victoria nearly destroyed Nathaniel after Julian died. The accusations, the lawsuits, the media smears, all while he was grieving and trying to save the company. What accusations? Eleanor hesitated. It's not my story to tell. But if Victoria approached you last night, be careful. She uses people as pawns in her vendetta against Nathaniel. Before Everly could press further, her phone chimed with a calendar alert. She was due in Nathaniel's office in 5 minutes to discuss the retreat center's next phase. She found him standing at his window, tension evident in the set of his shoulders. When he turned, his expression was carefully neutral, the mask firmly back in place. Ms. Mason, I wanted to clarify something about last night, he began. You don't owe me explanations, she interrupted. Perhaps not, but I value your opinion, and Victoria excels at sowing doubt. He gestured for her to sit. What did she tell you? That you made business decisions that got Julian killed. Nathaniel's jaw tightened. An oversimplification, but not entirely untrue. What happened? He sank into his chair, suddenly looking exhausted. Julian wanted to expand rapidly, new showrooms in 5 cities simultaneously. I advised caution, suggested a phased approach. We argued. I won. His voice grew distant. The night of the accident, we'd been celebrating a major contract. Julian was upset that I'd scaled back his vision again. He left early. And the crash. Single vehicle. Late night, rural road. Nathaniel's fingers found the silver ring. The investigation concluded he was distracted, possibly using his phone. I later discovered he'd been texting Victoria during the drive, still arguing about the expansion plans. The revelation hung in the air between them. Everly watched emotions flicker across Nathaniel's face. Grief, guilt, resignation. So you blame yourself, she said softly. If I had supported his vision. He let the sentence trail off. Victoria certainly blames me. She was pregnant when it happened. She lost the baby a week after Julian's funeral. Everly felt her heart constrict. That's tragic, but it doesn't make his death your fault, doesn't it? His gray eyes met hers. I curbed his passion to protect profits. What's that if not putting business before humanity? Exactly what you've accused me of doing. Before she could respond, his intercom buzzed. Mr. Blackwood, his secretary's voice announced. Ms. Harrington is on line 1 regarding the Sullivan project. Nathaniel's expression hardened. I'll take it. He looked at Everly. We'll continue the retreat center discussion later. As she left his office, Everly felt the weight of unresolved questions. Whatever had begun to thaw between them in Lake Haven seemed to be freezing over again, with Victoria Harrington's reappearance casting long shadows over their fragile connection. 3 days later, those shadows darkened considerably. Everly arrived at work to find Cameron waiting anxiously by her desk. Have you seen the business journal? He asked, sliding a tablet toward her. The headline made her stomach drop. Blackwood Enterprises CEO, in inappropriate relationship with junior employee. Below it, a photo of her and Nathaniel on the Art Institute terrace, manipulated to appear more intimate than it had been. It gets worse, Cameron said grimly. Victoria Harrington is quoted extensively, suggesting your rapid advancement comes from something other than talent. As Everly stared at the article in disbelief, Parker appeared, his expression grave. Mason, Blackwood wants to see you. Now. Nathaniel's office felt colder than usual as Everly entered. He stood with his back to her, staring out at the Chicago skyline. Close the door, he said without turning. Everly complied, heart hammering against her ribs. I've seen the article. Then you understand the situation. When he finally faced her, his expression was unreadable. Victoria has escalated her campaign. It's not true, Everly said firmly. We can fight this. Fighting only feeds the narrative. Nathaniel's voice was detached, clinical. The board is concerned about perception and potential liability. So we just let her win? Let her spread lies. We make strategic adjustments. He slid a document across his desk. Effective immediately, you'll be transferred to the analytics department. All communication between us will go through proper channels. Your contract remains in force. The words hit like physical blows. You're banishing me. I'm protecting the company. And you. Don't pretend this is for my benefit. Everly snapped, anger rising to mask the hurt. You're retreating behind your walls again because it's easier than fighting. Something flashed in his eyes, pain, perhaps, or regret, before disappearing. My personal feelings are irrelevant. The optics must be managed. Optics, she repeated bitterly. Always the businessman, even now. What would you have me do? For a moment, his composure cracked. Victoria won't stop. She's determined to destroy anything I value. The implication hung between them, unspoken but undeniable. Then stand up to her, Everly urged. Tell the truth about Julian. The truth is complicated. Nathaniel's expression closed again. This arrangement is temporary, until the situation resolves. And how long will that take? When he didn't answer, she laughed without humor. That's what I thought. She left without being dismissed, anger propelling her through the office where colleagues avoided her gaze. In analytics, she was assigned a sterile cubicle away from windows, creative work replaced by data entry. The demotion was painfully public, lending credence to the article's implications. 2 weeks of isolation followed. Everly found herself increasingly ostracized, former colleagues keeping their distance as if scandal were contagious. Only Cameron occasionally stopped by, providing quiet solidarity. This is wrong, he murmured one afternoon, perched on the edge of her desk. Everyone knows you earned your position. Apparently not everyone, she replied, nodding toward a group of executives who'd pointedly ignored her in the break room. Have you heard the latest? Cameron leaned closer. Victoria's company is making a play for Blackwood's largest client. Word is, she's using your situation as leverage, claiming ethical lapses in management. The news crystallized something in Everly's mind. This was never about me, she realized. I'm just collateral damage in her vendetta. That evening, determined to understand her enemy, Everly searched for more information about Victoria Harrington. Hours of digging revealed troubling patterns. Previous relationships that ended in litigation, business partners who mysteriously backed out of deals, consistent positioning of herself as a victim while accumulating power. A knock at her apartment door interrupted her research. She opened it to find Marcus Chun, a quiet analyst she'd barely interacted with. I apologize for coming unannounced, he said, shifting nervously. But I have information you should see. Inside, Marcus explained. He had been Julian Blackwood's assistant before the restructuring relegated him to a minor department. After the accident, Victoria demanded all Julian's files. I gave her copies, but kept the originals. He pulled out a thumb drive, including dashcam footage from Julian's car that night. Everly's breath caught. Does Nathaniel know this exists? No. Victoria told everyone the camera malfunctioned. Marcus's expression hardened. She was in the car with him, Ms. Mason. The police report was altered. She was driving, not Julian. She was intoxicated and lost control. The revelation stunned Everly. Why are you showing me this now? Because she's escalating. Yesterday, she threatened to expose supposed financial improprieties unless Nathaniel sells her controlling interest in the Lake Haven project. Marcus stood. Julian was my friend. His brother deserves to know the truth. After he left, Everly stared at the thumb drive, understanding finally dawning. Victoria's crusade against Nathaniel wasn't about Julian's vision or legacy. It was about covering her own guilt while systematically dismantling what he'd built. The next morning, she marched into Nathaniel's office without an appointment, startling Eleanor. Ms. Mason, you can't, the assistant began. It's all right, Eleanor, Nathaniel said, looking up wearily. He'd aged visibly in the past weeks, shadows beneath his eyes suggesting sleepless nights. When they were alone, Everly placed the thumb drive on his desk. Victoria was driving. She was drunk. The accident was her fault, not yours or Julian's. Color drained from his face. What are you talking about? Marcus Chin kept the original files. The dashcam footage shows everything. Nathaniel stared at the small device as if it might detonate. This can't be real. It is. And it explains everything. Why she's been so determined to destroy you. Why she twisted the narrative. Everly leaned forward. You've been carrying guilt that was never yours to bear. As understanding dawned, Nathaniel's carefully constructed walls began to crumble. 5 years of misplaced guilt and self-recrimination collapsed into a single, devastating moment of clarity. I've lost so much time, he whispered, more to himself than to her. Made so many mistakes. It's not too late to fix them, Everly said quietly, starting with the truth. His eyes met hers, vulnerability and determination mingling. I'll need your help. You already have it, she promised, reaching across the desk to cover his hand with hers. We fight back. Together. The 25th anniversary gala of Blackwood Enterprises transformed Chicago's Grand Pavilion into a showcase of elegance. Crystal chandeliers reflected off marble floors while the city's business elite mingled beneath soaring ceilings adorned with the company's innovative designs from past and present. Everly stood at the entrance, an invitation card clutched in her hand. After her dismissal from the analytics department 3 days earlier, officially for unauthorized access of executive files, she hadn't expected to receive the anonymous envelope containing a VIP invitation and a simple note. Be ready. She smoothed her midnight blue gown, drew a deep breath, and stepped inside. The crowd's subtle reaction rippled through the room. Raised eyebrows, whispered comments behind cocktail glasses. She ignored them, scanning faces until she spotted Victoria Harrington holding court near the main stage, resplendent in a crimson dress that matched her lipstick. Beside her stood Lawrence Drummond, CEO of Paragon Investments, Blackwood's largest competitor. Bold move showing up here. Cameron materialized beside her, offering a flute of champagne, especially after the termination. Someone wanted me here, she replied, taking the glass. Where's Nathaniel? Haven't seen him yet. But rumor has it Victoria's preparing to announce something big. Cameron lowered his voice. Paragon's making a hostile takeover bid, with her help. The lights dimmed slightly as Eleanor took the stage. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Blackwood Enterprises' 25th anniversary celebration. Her professional smile betrayed nothing of the turbulence of recent weeks. Our founder, Julian Blackwood, believed design should transform both spaces and lives. His brother and our CEO, Nathaniel Blackwood, has continued that legacy. Victoria's audible scoff drew knowing smiles from her entourage. Before Mr. Blackwood addresses you, Eleanor continued, we have a special presentation highlighting our journey. The room darkened further as screens lowered from the ceiling. Expectant murmurs settled into silence as images appeared. Early sketches from Julian, the first showroom, expansion milestones. Standard corporate nostalgia, until the presentation abruptly shifted. A date appeared, July 17th, 5 years ago, the night of Julian's death. The crowd stiffened collectively as dashcam footage began playing. The interior of Julian's car came into focus, showing Victoria behind the wheel, arguing loudly, a glass of wine in the center console. Julian's voice, concerned. Vic, you've had too much. Let me drive. Victoria, slurring slightly. I'm fine. Stop trying to control everything like your brother. The car swerved. Julian reached for the wheel. Victoria, watch the road. The footage ended with headlights illuminating trees, Victoria's scream, and impact. Gasps filled the ballroom. All eyes turned to Victoria, whose face had drained of color. This is a manipulation, she shouted, looking frantically around the room. A disgusting fake. The screen split to show police reports. The original, listing Victoria as driver, and the amended version naming Julian, with a highlighted signature of the officer who made the change. Turn this off immediately, Victoria demanded, but her words were drowned by the rise of shocked conversations throughout the room. Nathaniel Blackwood stepped onto the stage, immaculate in a tuxedo, his expression grave but unburdened. For 5 years, he began, silencing the crowd. I believed I contributed to my brother's death by opposing his vision. I carried that guilt into every decision, every interaction. I became someone Julian wouldn't recognize, someone I didn't recognize. His eyes found Everly in the crowd. Someone recently told me that when you feel trapped, any obligation becomes a cage. I've been in a cage of misplaced guilt, while the person truly responsible built her success on my brother's grave. Victoria pushed through the crowd toward an exit, but security personnel quietly blocked her path. Victoria Harrington was driving intoxicated the night Julian died. She altered police reports, manipulated witnesses, and used her status as Julian's grieving widow to avoid consequences. Nathaniel's voice remained steady. She then systematically attacked this company, Julian's legacy, while portraying herself as its rightful defender. He nodded to someone offstage, and Marcus Chin stepped forward, carrying a file. These documents have been provided to the state attorney's office. They include testimony from the responding officer, who was coerced into changing his report, and Julian's original will, which Ms. Harrington suppressed. Victoria lunged for the stage. You self-righteous bastard. You think this changes anything? You still held him back. You still clipped his wings every chance you got. Yes, Nathaniel acknowledged, surprising her into silence. I was too cautious with Julian's vision. I wanted sustainable growth while he wanted to soar immediately. That's something I'll always regret. He removed the silver ring from his finger, holding it up. But I didn't cause his death, and I won't carry your guilt any longer. Security began escorting a still protesting Victoria from the ballroom. Lawrence Drummond, seeing his takeover plans disintegrating, quietly followed the exit signs. As the commotion subsided, Nathaniel continued addressing the assembled guests, outlining a new direction for Blackwood Enterprises, one combining Julian's creative fearlessness with sustainable business practices. The Lake Haven Retreat Center would be the first expression of this balanced approach. Finally, he concluded, I owe a debt to someone whose courage reminded me what Blackwood was meant to be. His eyes searched the crowd again, but Everly had already slipped away, leaving only a champagne flute on a side table. Outside, breathing in the cool night air, Everly felt a complex mixture of vindication and emptiness. Justice had been served, but her position at Blackwood was gone. Her contract had been voided along with her employment. She had her freedom, the very thing she'd crashed a car trying to obtain in Lake Haven, yet it felt hollow. A text message illuminated her phone. You left too soon. There's more to say. She turned it off, hailed a taxi, and left the celebration behind, uncertain what tomorrow would bring, but knowing at least one man could finally begin to heal. 6 months after the explosive revelation at the Blackwood Gala, Manhattan's Soho district hummed with anticipation. Art critics, collectors, and curious patrons filled the prestigious Maddox Gallery for the opening of Boundaries, new works by Everly Mason. The space had been transformed by Everly's bold abstractions, canvases where rigid structures gave way to explosive color, where confinement and freedom engaged in eternal dialogue. Everly moved through the admiring crowd in a simple black dress that contrasted with her vibrant artwork. Her auburn hair was styled in loose waves, and though she smiled graciously at compliments, those who looked closely might notice a certain reserve in her green eyes. Success had come quickly after her departure from Chicago, but it hadn't entirely healed what she'd left behind. The interplay of confinement and freedom is absolutely fascinating, remarked Leonard Hirsch, an influential critic whose approval could make careers. He studied a large canvas where crimson and gold broke through geometric prison-like structures. Was there a specific inspiration? Life experiences, Everly answered diplomatically, offering the same response she'd given all evening. We all encounter boundaries. Some protect us, others confine us. The interesting part is determining which is which. Well, you've captured that ambiguity brilliantly, Hirsch said, making notes on his tablet. Rarely have I seen such emotional honesty in abstract work. Every piece tells a story of constraint and liberation. As Hirsch moved on, Lydia Maddox approached with 2 champagne flutes. The gallery owner was in her 50s, with silver-streaked black hair and the sharp eyes of someone who recognized talent before others did. You should be celebrating, Lydia said, handing Everly a glass. Every piece has sold. Everly blinked in surprise. Every one. There are 23 paintings. All to the same buyer, Lydia confirmed with a knowing smile. The Blackwood Mason Foundation for Emerging Artists. Apparently, they're furnishing their new headquarters and wanted the complete collection. They've also expressed interest in commissioning additional pieces. The crystal flute trembled slightly in Everly's hand. The foundation's name sent a surge of conflicting emotions through her: surprise, hope, uncertainty. She hadn't spoken to Nathaniel since leaving Chicago, had barely allowed herself to think of him, channeling all those complicated feelings into her art instead. When was the foundation established? She asked, striving for casual interest. Just 2 months ago, from what I understand. They're making quite a splash in the arts community, significant grants to young artists, particularly those addressing themes of transformation and renewal. Lydia studied Everly's face. I assumed you knew about it, given the name. No, Everly admitted softly. I didn't. The evening continued, a blur of conversations and congratulations. Critics praised her authentic voice and unflinching examination of psychological confinement. Collectors asked about her process. Through it all, Everly maintained her composure while inwardly processing the implications of Nathaniel reaching out in such a meaningful yet respectful way, creating something that honored their connection without demanding her return. By 11, most guests had departed. Everly lingered in the now-quiet gallery, slowly walking past her own creations. Each captured a piece of her journey. The suffocating contract, the desperate flight through the storm, the revelation about Victoria, the painful separation. Art had been her salvation these past months, allowing her to transform trauma into beauty, restriction into release. She was saying goodnight to Lydia near the entrance when a familiar figure appeared in the doorway, silhouetted against the city lights. Nathaniel Blackwood stood perfectly still, as if uncertain of his welcome. He looked different, more relaxed in a charcoal suit without a tie, his dark hair slightly longer than the severe corporate cut he'd maintained in Chicago. Most noticeably, the perpetual tension in his shoulders had disappeared, and his gray eyes held a quiet hopefulness that made him appear younger, more like the man from the sailboat photograph. Congratulations on a successful opening, he said simply, his deep voice sending an involuntary shiver through her. Thank you, she replied, heartbeat accelerating. And thank you for the purchases. Though using my name for your foundation seems a bit presumptuous. The ghost of a smile touched his lips. Accurate, perhaps. It was your vision that reshaped mine. Lydia tactfully excused herself with a whispered, "Lock up when you're done," slipping Everly the gallery keys before disappearing into the Manhattan night. Alone among her artwork, Everly and Nathaniel regarded each other with the careful attention of people who had once seen each other clearly, then lost sight of one another through circumstance and choice. You've been busy, Nathaniel observed, moving toward a canvas that depicted a storm-tossed lake with a small light visible through the darkness. Lake Haven, among other things. She watched him trace the air just above the painted surface, never quite touching it. And you? How's Blackwood Enterprises? Transformed. He met her gaze directly. We've restructured everything. Flexible working policies, creative sabbaticals, mentorship programs. The Lake Haven Retreat Center opens next month as a space for renewal, not just corporate strategy sessions. So you're finally embracing Julian's vision and finding my own. Nathaniel moved to another painting, abstract figures breaking free from geometric constraints. The board wasn't entirely pleased with the changes. I imagine not. Victoria is facing charges for evidence tampering and obstruction. She's agreed to a settlement that includes relinquishing all claims to Julian's estate. His clinical tone couldn't disguise his relief at finally achieving closure. Some wounds are beginning to heal. Everly noticed he no longer wore the silver ring that had been his constant companion. I'm glad you found peace. Not entirely. His gray eyes held hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. I've recovered my brother's legacy, but lost something else equally valuable. The quiet admission hung between them as moonlight streamed through the gallery's skylight, casting both in silver illumination that transformed the moment into something almost otherworldly. You haven't lost me, Everly whispered, surprising herself with the confession. I needed space to find myself outside of Blackwood's walls, to ensure that whatever I felt wasn't just Stockholm Syndrome. A flicker of pain crossed his features. And what did you discover? Before she could answer, Nathaniel reached into his pocket. May I show you something first? He opened his palm to reveal the silver ring she'd grown accustomed to seeing on his finger. This was my mother's before Julian wore it briefly. I've been carrying it as a burden, but it was meant to be a symbol of continuity and choice. Why are you showing me this? She asked, voice barely audible. Because I want you to understand what I'm offering. His voice softened to match hers, creating an intimate space in the quiet gallery. Not another contract or obligation. Not ownership or control. Just possibility. Everly's throat tightened with unexpected emotion. Nathaniel, I spent 5 years believing I killed my brother's dream. He continued, vulnerability evident in every word. Then you arrived and showed me I was killing my own. When you left Chicago, I finally understood what freedom really means. And what is that? She asked, blinking back unexpected tears. The ability to choose your own boundaries. To build walls that protect rather than imprison. He set the ring on a nearby pedestal, making no move to place it in her hand. I'm not asking you to return to Chicago or to Blackwood Enterprises. I'm asking if there's room in your freedom for someone else who's learning to be free. Everly studied him. The man who had once represented everything she resisted, now standing vulnerably before her creations that depicted her journey to liberty. The transformation in him was evident, not just in his relaxed posture or the absence of the corporate mask, but in the way he looked at her, with respect for her independence even as he offered connection. There's a new design center opening in Tribeca, she said finally. They might benefit from collaboration with the Blackwood Mason Foundation. Nathaniel's smile was genuine, reaching his eyes in a way that reminded her of the young man in the sailboat photograph. I believe that could be arranged. He gestured toward the final painting in the exhibition, still covered by a cloth. Is that part of the collection? It's personal, Everly admitted, a flush rising to her cheeks. I wasn't sure I'd include it. At his questioning look, she moved to the canvas and carefully removed the covering. The painting revealed the Lake Haven Lodge at dawn, mist rising from the lake, two silhouettes standing close together watching the sunrise after a storm. The brushwork was different from her other pieces, more detailed, more intimate, capturing a moment of shared vulnerability that had changed everything. The moment everything changed, Nathaniel said softly. For both of us. He stepped closer, close enough that she could detect the familiar scent of his cologne. May I ask what you decided? About what you felt at Blackwood versus what you feel now. Everly looked up at him, suddenly aware of how much she'd missed his presence, his intelligence, the intensity with which he engaged with the world. I discovered that some connections transcend circumstances, that what began in captivity could continue in freedom, if both people are truly free. Outside the gallery windows, Manhattan's lights glittered against the night sky, a constellation of possibilities. Everly picked up the silver ring from the pedestal, examining it thoughtfully before returning it to Nathaniel's palm and closing his fingers around it. Keep this for now, she said, a smile playing at her lips. Let's write our own story first, without symbols or obligations. Just two people choosing each other freely. Nathaniel's hand trembled slightly as he accepted the ring back. I'd like that very much. For a moment, they stood still in the moonlight, the distance between Chicago and New York, between past and future, collapsing into this single point of connection. Then Nathaniel slowly, cautiously raised his hand to her cheek, giving her every opportunity to step away. Instead, Everly leaned into his touch, her eyes closing briefly at the contact she denied herself for so long. When she opened them again, she found him watching her with such tender intensity that words became unnecessary. He bent toward her, pausing just before their lips met, one final offering of choice. Everly eliminated the last breath of distance between them, sealing their new beginning with a kiss that held both the heat of everything unspoken and the promise of everything yet to come. When they finally parted, tears glistened in Everly's eyes, matched by the suspicious brightness in Nathaniel's. I never expected this, she confessed, voice breaking. To find freedom and love in the same journey. Perhaps one isn't possible without the other, he replied, drawing her close again as a tear escaped to trace a silver path down her cheek. Real love requires two free people choosing each other every day. As they left the gallery together, walking into the vibrant New York night with fingers intertwined, Everly felt the final constraints of her past falling away. The journey that had begun with a restrictive contract had led her here, to authentic freedom and unexpected love, both hard-won and infinitely more valuable for the struggle. Behind them, moonlight illuminated her paintings, testaments to boundaries overcome and new beginnings embraced with open eyes and healing hearts. But the most powerful canvas remained unfinished, the life they would create together, stroke by stroke, choice by choice, in perfect, liberated harmony.